Okay, we are going to move on. We haven't talked about this yet. The long journey home for the 7th Cavalry. We've had the discovery of the deaths. We've had those people that have perished buried. We have survivors and wounded. And now it's time to leave the Little Bighorn River Valley and head back. What happened to the wounded men from the 7th Cavalry? And they were not from Custer's cavalry, were they? Because they were all dead. So they were from whose? Were they from Bentine's?
No.
Not a lot, because there wasn't a lot of soldiers killed during the Reno-Bentine assault.
Mostly Reno's, all right.
Renos. So the men that were wounded had to survive a 15-mile journey by mule to the mouth of the Little Bighorn River. Okay, so they had to survive a 15-mile journey by mule. You can imagine riding on mules while you were feeling not very good after being wounded. What was docked in the mouth of the Little Bighorn River?
Far west.
The far west, which had moved from where?
From where,
Mouth of the Rosebud Creek, remember? Okay, so the far west had docked in the mouth of the Little Bighorn River, and those men that were wounded survived a painful 15-mile journey by mule to the far west. So on June 30th, 1876, after the wounded men were aboard the far west, the steamship went down the Bighorn back to the Yellowstone River. So the wounded were taken aboard the Far West, and on June 30th, 1876, the Far West steamed down the Bighorn toward the Yellowstone River. It would be a 700-mile journey from where they get in the Yellowstone River to Bismarck, North Dakota, and then on to Fort, where'd they leave from? In North Dakota, Lincoln. Okay? So it's going to be a 700-mile journey from where the Far West puts in at the Yellowstone from the Bighorn. They're going to go to Bismarck, North Dakota, and then on to Fort Lincoln. The Far West arrived in Bismarck at 11 p.m. the night of July 5th, 1876. 54 hours and 710 miles from the time they left the mouth of the Little Bighorn. And I'll repeat that. So the Far West arrived in Bismarck at 11 p.m. the night of July 5th, 1876, which was 54 hours and 710 miles from the mouth of the Little Bighorn River where the steamship was first docked. Yep.
How fast was the train going?
It was a boat.
Or a boat, I mean.
It varied depending on the current. 54 hours and 710 miles from the mouth of the Little Bighorn. Well, who hasn't received any news about this yet?
Grant.
Libby Custer. So she received the news first at Fort Lincoln. She was sitting in her house quilting with several other women. Military personnel called her to the door, informed her of the situation, and then the soldiers asked her to go with them to inform the other women of their deaths, of their husbands' deaths. So the first one contacted at Fort Lincoln by the military was Libby Custer. When she received the news, they asked her if she would go with them to inform the other women of their husbands' deaths. She was sitting in her house quilting when she was given the news.
So, after they told her her husband was dead, they had her tell other people.
They had her go with them, just for support. Now, a quote that goes down in history is Libby agreed to go with those. She turned to Margaret Calhoun, who was sitting next to her, knitting, and said, "We must pack now. We are not in the Army anymore." So she's very stoic when the word came to her, very brave. She turned to Margaret Calhoun, which was who? Her sister-in-law, because that was George Custer's sister, who had married Lieutenant Calhoun, right? And she turned to Margaret Calhoun, her sister-in-law, and said, "We must pack now. We are not in the Army anymore." Now this was obviously once they got back to Fort Lincoln, what spread like wildfire?
Panic?
Well, not panic, but the news of what happened. This was 1876. It was the 100th birthday of our country. Was that a good birthday present or good news? No, it was very hot news, so to speak. It began to circulate like wildfire. It was not a time for embarrassing news. It was a time for celebration. It was, you know, the 100th birthday of the country. And what happens when bad news comes when it's supposed to be a good time? What begins to circulate?
Depression, alcohol.
No, not so much that, but think about somebody's got to take the what
The
for it?
president.
The blame. So blame starts to circulate because we're supposed to be getting good news. They were hoping that Custer and the 7th Cavalry would come back with great news of putting the Indian on the reservation, the mighty hostile. Instead, they come back with news that the entire 7th Cavalry pretty much has been wiped out. And Custer himself, a great Civil War general, has been killed. So who played a great part in the Custer controversy for years and years?
Sheridan.
Grant.
No person, no one person.
Go.
Who, no, close. Who likes to stir up controversy?
Media.
The media.
Dang it.
The media.
Radical.
So the press, which another name for the media, the press played an important part in the Custer controversy for years to come. And everything in a lot of things in the paper were inaccurate, and they were guesses, and they were summaries because nobody survived to tell the story. So speculation was running rampant. Matter of fact, there was only one newspaper person on the entire campaign, and he stayed with Terry. So nobody, lucky for him, nobody had any, inside information. They could only speculate. Why did they only have one newspaper person with them? Think about this, see if anybody's really got this story. Why was only one newspaper person sent? Kind of alluded to it in the movie. What they tell Custer not to do. That's right. They sent one media person because General Grant was concerned that Custer would be, talking to the media all the time. So the reason there was only one media person and that person stayed with Terry was because Grant was concerned that what Custer might do or say with the media on his side. The only correspondent that went was Clement Loonsbury, who's on your ID sheet. He was the editor of the Bismarck Tribune. So the only correspondent that went with the 7th Cavalry was Clement Loonsbury, who's on your ID sheet, and he was the editor of the Bismarck Tribune. And he stayed with General Terry. Or did he? Actually, he had a big illness in his family, and it prevented him from going, so he sent his assistant, Mark Kellogg. So I kind of threw you off a little bit, let's point to it. So Loonsbury, who was the editor of the Bismarck Tribune, was given permission to go on the campaign, to stay with Terry. He was pretty excited about it, but he got ill. Somebody in his family got ill, and he decided not to go, and he sent his assistant, Mark Kellogg. Now, Kellogg didn't listen near as much, and he knew the news was going to be made by who? Custer. So Kellogg stuck close to the 7th Cavalry instead of staying close to Terry.
Did he die?
Well, let's get to that.
Well, if he's in the 7th Cavalry.
Well, but not all the 7th Cavalry was killed because we had Reno's men, right? Well, as they were going, Kellogg sent reports back to Bismarck, who then sent them back to the New York Herald. So there was some coverage on this thing, okay? Because Kellogg didn't do what maybe he was supposed to in a way. He went with Custer instead of staying with Terry. Do you think General Grant wanted this newspaper person with Custer? No. Well, on June 29th, 1876, Colonel Gibbon and his men who were on burial detail, guess where they found Kellogg's body?
Next to Custer.
In the deep ravine. He was one of the 28 bodies in the deep ravine. So on June 29th, 1876, Colonel Gibbon found Kellogg's body in the deep ravine. where Troop E had been slaughtered. That death prevented everyone in the nation from ever knowing what happened. Because was he with the Reno charge, Kellogg? No. Okay? All right. Now, in 1877, remember we told you that those military personnel were buried the night where they fell? They were all dug up in 1877. And I'll give you a detailed account where every soldier that perished is buried. 197 plus. That's going to take us a long time, you think, huh? Not so much. Okay, anybody know where George Armstrong Custer's remains were re-entered? West Point, New York. You'd be amazed how many people go to the Little Bighorn Battlefield Cemetery and look for Custer. It just drives me insane. You shouldn't even be there if you don't know that, for crying out loud. So he's buried in West Point, New York. You wouldn't believe how many people think he's buried under that white headstone that's etched in black on the battlefield. None of them are. Okay? Tom Custer was buried at Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery. Anybody know what state that's in?
You're close.
W.W. Cook was G.W. Yates also was buried at Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery. Yates. Dug up and reburied at Fort Leavenworth. W.W. Cook, the man with the sideburns, he was actually unearthed twice. The first time they re-entered him at Custer Battlefield National Cemetery, which is at the battlefield. Then they exhumed him and re-entered him again at Hamilton Cemetery in Hamilton, Ontario. Okay. So his family was there. W.W. Cook was originally re-entered at Custer Battlefield National Cemetery, but then they exhumed him again and they buried him at Hamilton Cemetery in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Yeah.
How did they decide where to bury these people?
Family. Family chose. Because remember, they just buried where they fell. Wouldn't that be is that where you'd want your in shallow graves? No. Yeah.
Custer was buried at West Point, that went there in the child.
That's where his family chose. That's where Libby wanted.
After these guys were all like very dug up and stuff, did they still have the markers of where?
Right where they fell. Yep.
How did they keep them?
They kept track of that, believe it or not. Yeah, kept track of it. Okay, how about Miles Keogh? He was reburied at Fort Hill Cemetery in New York.
Who? Keogh?
Keogh. Fort Hill, just like a hill, cemetery in New York. Keogh. Where do you think Boston Custer and Audie Reed were buried? Think.
West Point.
No, they weren't even military people.
Well, I got you.
In their hometown.
Which was what?
In Michigan.
Monroe, Michigan. Very good. So Boston Custer and Audie Reed were exhumed in 1878 and buried in Monroe, Michigan.
Where's Libby buried?
We'll get to that, okay? Now, I didn't mention all of them. There are others that were exhumed, but I could go on a while. But how about the other, soldiers, the enlisted guys? They were all dug up in 1881. And guess where they're all buried?
The Custer Memorial.
At the Custer Memorial, that big memorial that's on top of the hill, they're all buried under it, on the top of Custer Hill. So the remains of the 7th Cavalry were collected from their shallow graves, and they were re-entered into a mass grave on top of Custer Hill. And their names are mass grave. They're all buried together, and you'll see the names of all of them when you get up there on the side of the... It's a great big monument.
Wait,
And they're all buried in there.
The rest of them? Just the rest of them?
The rest, yeah. The enlisted men, not the officers. All the officers and family members of officers were buried elsewhere. I didn't mention them all. But the enlisted men were exhumed where they fell. They left the markers where they fell, put white markers later, and they are all buried in a mass grave at the top of Custer Hill, which you get a chance to see. And answering, I think it was Wade's question, they marked their remains, but they put the white marble markers in 1890. So in 1890 is when these white markers were all put down. They marked them with wooden poles, or teepee poles. or just basically graves until, they weren't TP poles, they redid them, put crosses. But they did the marble white markers where they fell in 1890. Okay, let's talk about the other men that weren't killed. We got several of them we can talk about. Whatever happened to them? I'm going to give you all kinds of information on Daniel Kneipe and Giovanni Martini and Thomas Weir and Winfield Edgerly and Frederick Bantine and Reno. Whatever happened to those guys? Okay, I'm going to tell you. Oh, they eventually did. We'll start with Daniel Kneipe. What did Daniel Kneipe do in the first place?
He was the guy that
Took the
message
first message.
to,
Okay, first message to McDougal. Okay, he was discharged from the 7th Cavalry
Honorably or dishonorably?
honorably on August 7th, 1877 at the rank of sergeant. What was his rank when he was given the message? Sergeant.
On August what?
Okay, August 7th, 1877, Daniel Kneipe was discharged. He kept his rank of sergeant. Now you'd think after something like that, maybe you'd had enough of military service. He actually re-enlisted in the U.S. Army and served in World War I. Yeah, Kneipe re-enlisted and served in World War I. Well, he wasn't very old then, so.
Did he die in World War I?
Nope, he died at the age of 73 in 1926 and was buried in South Carolina. So he died at the age of 73 in 1926 and was buried in South Carolina. Daniel Kneipe. How about our old buddy Giovanni Martini, the trumpeter, who sent the second message?
Suicide.
Who was that?
Giovanni Martini. He was also discharged from the 7th Cavalry in 1879, and his rank was Trumpeter of Excellent Character. It's the highest rank that a trumpeter can get. Okay? Yep, so Giovanni Martini was discharged from the 7th Cavalry in 1879. He achieved the rank of Trumpeter of Excellent Character, which is the highest ranking a trumpeter can get. That's what he did, he was a trumpeter. He also re-enlisted in the Army, didn't serve in World War I, but he did serve in the military until 1904 when he retired. So he re-enlists again, just as Kneipe does, and he serves in the military until 1904. He also, ironically, died at the age of 73. He died in 1922 and was buried in Brooklyn, New York. So Giovanni Martini dies at the age of 73 in 1922 and is buried in Brooklyn, New York. Pretty good stories, those two. How about Thomas Weir? What happened to Thomas Weir?
Became an alcoholic.
depressed.
After the campaign of 1876 and went on, his health was severely impaired. He had trouble with his health. That doesn't mean he was crippled. This means his overall health was not very good after the campaign of 1876. So he stayed in the Army. What might they assign somebody to do? And he did this in New York City, by the way, if they're really unable health-wise to fulfill military duties. So he's in the military. What? Close. But what is this type of person? Does a lot of paperwork.
Signing people places?
Well,
It's
not.
like
Military police.
You're gonna say it.
the person that, oh, the thing that,
Brant Knight.
that.
Yeah, he's the recruiter. And that's what he did, is he was assigned to duty to recruit in the recruiting office in New York City. So he spent the rest of his military career recruiting. Unfortunately, he died at the age of 38 suddenly, and was buried in New York in 18, excuse me. Now think about this. He died suddenly at the age of 38 on December 9th, 1876. How long was he a recruiter? Not very long. July, August, September, October, November, and he died the 9th of December. So just barely over 5 months he lived after the campaign of 1876. Died at the age of 38 and was buried in New York.
What did he die from?
Just suddenly, probably a heart attack or something, yeah. Okay, who was Winfield Edgerly? In your notes.
He was the guy that followed Weir after.
He's the guy that provided, very good, he provided support for Weir and Benteen as they were running back from Weir Point, remember? That guy stayed in the military until 1917 and retired. Just stayed, he never did get out. He stayed in the military from the time that the campaign of 1876 ended, stayed in it all the way through till 1917.
When he got out, like right before America got into World War I.
Well, he was too old. But he eventually died, he was 81, he died in 1927 and is buried in New Hampshire. You gotta figure 1876, 86, 96, 1906, 1917, that was 40 years after the battle. He was probably 20 then, so he was 60 by the time 1917 came around. 70. Okay, how about Charles Windolph? You've never heard of Charles Windolph, have you?
No.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you about him. There's gotta be some significance, I'll take the end. Where do you think he fought, since we're talking about it?
The Reno battle.
He was up in the Reno battlefield. Obviously, he wasn't wiped out, okay? Charles Windolph was actually, embarrassing as it might be, but lucky as it might be, was shot in the buttocks on June 25th, 1876, during the Reno Charge. And after the campaign of 1876, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Okay, not because he was shot in the buttocks, because he did some things that were very heroic up on Reno Hill while shot in the buttocks.
What did he do?
So he helped save a lot of lives. He received that honor of the